I'm Rachel Monroe, 31 years old, and I'll never forget the blinding white light of that emergency room ceiling or the sound of my father hanging up on me. The smell of antiseptic filled the air sharp enough to sting my nose, while pain radiated through my ribs and leg like fire. My phone was slick with sweat and blood when I heard his voice on the other end, tired, impatient, already somewhere else. "Are you dying?" he asked. "Because your sister's having another episode, and she needs me right now." Then the line went dead, leaving only the flat beep of my heart monitor and the hum of fluorescent lights. I was 20 minutes out of surgery, barely conscious and already forgotten. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever been the one expected to be strong, no matter how much it hurt. I grew up in a small Ohio town where being dependable was considered a virtue, and I wore that label like a badge. My mom died when I was 16, and after that, my father clung to my younger sister as if she were the last fragile thing left in his world. Lauren was always delicate, anxious, emotional, endlessly creative. She painted on the walls, switched hobbies every season, and melted down when life didn't bend to her rhythm. Dad called her sensitive. He called me steady. That difference decided everything about who we became. He would rush home if she cried during a storm, but when I sprained an ankle in track practice, he told me to toughen up and drive myself to urgent care. After college, I landed a job in finance while Lauren bounced between majors and moved back home twice. I sent money when she couldn't make rent. I mailed checks when her car broke down. Each time Dad thanked me with the same hollow praise. "You've always been so responsible," as if my usefulness mattered more than my well-being. I convinced myself it was love. I told myself he just worried about her more because she needed him more. I learned to make peace with being second because it seemed easier than fighting for first. But that night after the crash, peace felt like a lie. One moment I was driving home from work in the rain. The next, headlights spun across the windshield and glass shattered around me. When I woke up, paramedics were shouting vitals. My leg twisted at an angle it shouldn't bend. By the time I reached the hospital, my phone had cracked. My body felt like it was stitched together with fire. And I only wanted to hear one voice, the man who'd told me all my life he'd be there in an emergency. Instead, I got a dial tone. Hours passed. The nurse who cleaned the blood from my hands asked if anyone was coming. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure anymore. The waiting room clock ticked so loud I could feel it in my chest. Every sound, the rolling of carts, the distant cough of another patient reminded me that I was alone. Somewhere across town, my father was probably holding my sister's hand while she cried over a job interview. That thought should have made me angry. Instead, it just made me tired. As the night stretched on, pain medication dulled everything but the truth. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was the story of my life. The birthday parties where Lauren got backyard lights and crowds while mine were quiet dinners with store-bought cake. The graduation Dad missed because Lauren had a panic attack over a test grade. The years I sent half my paycheck to help them, believing that someday I'd be seen as more than a safety net. Every memory pointed to the same pattern: I was the strong one, and strong people didn't need care. The nurse returned near midnight, checked my vitals, and asked gently if she should call anyone else. That simple question cracked something open in me. I realized there wasn't anyone else not in my family anyway. My father had spent so long tending to Lauren's storms that he'd forgotten who steadied the house when the wind blew. I'd lived my entire adult life trying not to make trouble, trying to earn peace by staying useful. But lying there with stitches down my side and a cast on my leg, I understood that usefulness had replaced love. When the hallway lights dimmed and the hospital quieted, I reached for my phone again. My hands trembled as I scrolled past Dad's number and stopped at another contact I hadn't used in years. Megan Price, an attorney I'd once hired for a minor lease dispute. She had listened then without judgment. Maybe she would again. The call went to voicemail, but hearing her calm, recorded voice gave me something I hadn't felt all night: control. I left a message asking her to visit in the morning. Not to sue anyone, not yet, just to talk. By dawn, I decided something I'd never dared before. If the people who were supposed to protect me couldn't show up, then I'd start protecting myself. The hum of machines faded as sunlight crept through the blinds, warm against my bruised skin. My father still hadn't arrived, but for once, that silence didn't feel like a wound. It felt like the start of something clean. I didn't know it yet, but the next time he walked through that door, I wouldn't be the same daughter waiting for his approval. I'd be the woman finally ready to stop waiting altogether. By the time morning settled over the hospital, I'd been moved from trauma to a private room. The blinds were half open, letting a thin band of sunlight stripe across my blanket. Machines clicked and hummed around me, steady as breathing. My phone sat on the tray beside me, black screen reflecting the pale ceiling above. I hadn't heard from my father once. The nurses kept asking if family was on the way, and every time I said yes, hoping that would make it true. But the hallway stayed quiet, and the only sound that ever came through the door was the squeak of rubber soles and the low murmur of passing voices. I tried to focus on the physical pain because it was easier to understand. The crash had left my left leg in a cast up to the knee, my ribs bruised, and a row of stitches running across my side. But it was the stillness that hurt the most, the space where someone should have been sitting. Nurse Danielle came in around 9, soft-voiced, carrying a small cup of water and a new IV bag. "How's the pain level?" she asked. I said it was manageable. She adjusted the blanket, then paused like she wanted to ask something more. "You sure no one's coming?" she said gently. I smiled the way you do when you want to end a conversation kindly. "They'll be here," I told her. She gave a quiet nod, though we both knew it was a polite lie. The hours passed in fragments, footsteps, meal trays, nurses changing shifts. I drifted between sleep and awareness until a faint memory rose to the surface. Birthdays when I was younger. The way Dad used to set 2 different tables in the backyard, one for Lauren's friends and one for me. Hers would be covered in colored balloons and cake tiers, mine in a simple dinner spread with store candles. He'd say, "You never wanted much anyway." It had been easier to agree than admit it hurt. As I lay there, I could see it all clearly now. The pattern had always been there, Lauren as the delicate one, the dreamer with endless chances. I was the reliable one, the problem solver who didn't need attention. When Lauren forgot to pay her rent, Dad wired her money overnight. When I mentioned my old laptop was barely working, he said, maybe I should start saving for a new one. The more capable I became, the less visible I was. And somewhere along the line, I had accepted that as love. I tried to remember the last time he'd really looked at me, not as a resource, but as his daughter. Maybe it was after Mom's funeral. I was 16, holding his coat while he comforted Lauren, who was sobbing loud enough to make strangers turn their heads. He'd brushed past me, whispered, "Take care of your sister," and that became my role ever since. Responsibility had a way of disguising itself as affection, and I'd learned to wear that mask well. Around noon, I turned on the small TV just to break the silence. News anchors talked about traffic and weather people I didn't know, laughing softly at stories that felt too far away from where I was. I muted the volume. Outside the window, the sky looked washed out, too bright to stare at directly. I thought of calling Dad again, but my thumb hovered over the screen before I stopped myself. The last words he'd said still echoed, "Don't call in a panic." He hadn't even asked which hospital I was in. That realization made something inside me go still. It wasn't the shock of a single betrayal. It was recognition, a truth I'd avoided naming for years. Every moment I had excused, every time I told myself he means well, stacked up until the weight of it pressed down like a second cast I couldn't remove. I closed my eyes and drifted backward through memory, the day he missed my college graduation, because Lauren had failed another exam. The night he asked me to cover her credit card bill because she's still finding her footing. Each favor came wrapped in guilt, each excuse delivered with that same soft disappointment that made me believe I was strong enough to absorb it. And maybe I had been until the moment I wasn't. The nurse came again mid-afternoon with a tray. "Any word from your family yet?" she asked. "Not yet," I said quietly. She hesitated, then placed a folded blanket across my lap. "You rest, okay. You don't have to do everything alone." The words caught me off guard. They sounded too kind, almost dangerous in their tenderness. After she left, I looked at that blanket for a long time before I realized why it mattered, because it was the first time in years someone had offered me comfort without asking for something in return. By evening, the pain medication had dulled the edges of everything except thought. My mind ran in circles, work deadlines, car insurance, the noise of what tomorrow might look like. Then it stopped on one simple, unbearable image: me on this hospital bed, waiting for someone who wasn't coming. I had spent my whole life waiting for my father to notice the quiet kind of loyalty that didn't demand anything back. I'd given him every version of myself that was easy to love: the responsible daughter, the fixer, the calm one. But all it did was teach him that I could handle being forgotten. When the hallway lights dimmed for the night, I reached for my phone again. The cast on my arm made it awkward to hold, but I found the contact I needed and typed out a message. "Hi, Megan. It's Rachel. I'm in the hospital. I could use your help tomorrow if you're available." I hesitated before sending it, not sure what kind of help I even meant. But pressing that button felt different than any call I'd ever made home. The reply came quicker than I expected. "Of course. I'll be there first thing in the morning." Just reading those words eased something I hadn't realized was clenched inside me. It was strange how a simple act of being seen could feel like air after years of holding your breath. The room fell quiet again, machines whispering their steady rhythm. I stared up at the ceiling until the lines of fluorescent light blurred together. My father's silence, once familiar, no longer felt like disappointment. It felt like proof. Proof of the difference between love that shows up and love that makes excuses. I wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time the thought didn't scare me. When I finally drifted to sleep, the phone rested in my hand screen, still glowing softly with Megan's message. Somewhere outside, traffic moved along the main road, headlights flashing like small, distant stars. The city carried on as if nothing had changed, but I knew something had. Tomorrow, the world I'd built around their approval would start to crack, and beneath it, something truer was waiting to take shape. Megan arrived early the next morning, the faint scent of coffee following her as she stepped into the hospital room. Her navy suit was crisp, her hair pulled back neatly, and her calm expression felt like the first sign of order I'd seen since the accident. "Good morning," she said softly, pulling a chair beside my bed. "How are you holding up?" I told her I was managing, which was only half true. She set her briefcase on the tray table and gave me a look that said she understood more than I'd said. "Then let's take care of the rest," she replied. I handed her a small flash drive I had kept in my overnight bag. It contained months of quiet preparation, copies of transfers, receipts, and messages I'd stored without really knowing why. I had spent years covering expenses that weren't mine, slipping money into gaps my father and sister created. Megan connected the drive to her laptop, the screen's glow reflecting off her glasses as lines of numbers filled the page. She didn't speak right away. The steady clicking of keys filled the silence between us until she finally turned the screen toward me. "Nearly $100,000, she said quietly. "Over 5 years." I stared at the number as if it belonged to someone else. Rent payments, credit card, balances, therapy sessions, car repairs, all those small rescues that had seemed harmless at the time added up to the weight of a mortgage. Megan's tone stayed even. "This isn't generosity, Rachel. It's dependence, and it's gone unchecked for too long." She opened another document, one I recognized from an earlier conversation we'd had years ago. "You gave your father general power of attorney after your mother passed, correct?" I nodded. "We'll revoke that today." As she prepared the forms, I watched the sunlight shift across the walls. The beeping from the monitor matched the slow rhythm of her typing. "I'll remove both of them from your will and all shared accounts," she continued. "After that, we'll lock your financial access to them entirely." She paused before meeting my eyes. "You're not cutting them off out of anger. You're protecting yourself." Her words hit with more clarity than comfort. She printed the documents, and I signed them one by one, the sound of pen on paper marking the quiet end of a chapter I hadn't realized was already closing. My signature trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from exhaustion. When I looked up, Megan gave a faint nod. "That's it," she said. "It's official." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The hospital room hummed with quiet machines, and a low ache spread across my ribs where the cast met my skin. Megan gathered the papers into a neat stack, sliding them into her folder. "They may not take this well," she warned. "I'll notify them directly, but I'd prefer to be here when they arrive." I asked how she knew they would come. She smiled without humor. People who rely on control rarely give it up quietly. By late afternoon, I felt the familiar pressure build in my chest, that uneasy stillness that comes before something breaks. The nurse had helped me adjust the bed, the room cleaned, the air turned cool and dry. The clock read 4:30 when I heard footsteps outside the door, heavier than the quiet shuffle of hospital staff. Megan stood, already composed. "They're here," she said. The door opened without a knock. My father entered first. His tie loosened as if he'd rushed there, though the irritation on his face told another story. Lauren followed behind her sunglasses, perched on her head like armor, her mouth already set in a pout. "Rachel," my father said, his voice sharp but falsely calm. "This is unnecessary. You could have called instead of making a scene." Megan didn't move. "Mr. Monroe." "I'm Megan Price, your daughter's attorney," she said, her tone professional but firm. "We'll keep this short." Lauren gave a small laugh. "An attorney? For what, we're family?" She looked at me like I was a stranger. "You're being ridiculous." I shifted upright, the cast pulling against my leg. "You left me here alone." I said, my voice steady but low. "I was bleeding and you left." My father's expression tightened. "You weren't dying," he snapped. "Lauren was in crisis. She needed me. For a job interview," I said. "She didn't get hired and you left me in an emergency room." He opened his mouth again, ready to turn the blame back on me, but Megan's voice cut through the room. "Before we continue," she said evenly, "Rachel has authorized me to play a recording." She tapped her phone and the sound filled the space, his voice impatient and cold. "Are you dying? Don't call in a panic. Lauren needs support right now." The silence that followed was heavy. Lauren's face went pale. My father's jaw flexed as he turned toward me. "You recorded me," he demanded. "Yes," I said quietly, "after you hung up, because I knew you'd pretend this never happened." His anger flared, but before he could speak, Megan placed the folder on the table. "As of today," she said, "Rachel has revoked all shared financial access and power of attorney. She is no longer responsible for any of your expenses, debts, or obligations. All authorizations have been terminated." Lauren's voice cracked. "You can't do that. I need help. I can't move back home." "That's not my problem anymore," I said. "I've helped for years. You've had every chance to stand on your own." My father stepped forward, his voice rising. "After everything I did for you." "You raised me to clean up your messes," I interrupted. "That's not parenting." He stopped mid-sentence. The words hung there unmovable. For the first time I saw him hesitate, not because he understood, but because he didn't know what to say. Megan collected the folder and nodded toward the door. "We're done here." My father looked between us, his face red, his control slipping. Lauren whispered something to him, but he didn't respond. They walked out without another word, the door closing with a soft click that echoed louder than any argument could have. For a while I couldn't move. The air felt thick, my heartbeat loud in my ears. Megan remained beside me, her tone softer now. "They'll push back," she said. "Expect anger, guilt, maybe even public blame. Don't respond. Let me handle it." I nodded, still staring at the door. "I'm tired," I said quietly. "I know," she answered. "But you did what you needed to do." When she left later that evening, the light outside had turned golden, slipping through the blinds in thin stripes. The silence felt different now, not the hollow kind that used to follow disappointment, but something calmer, heavier, like the moment after a storm, when everything is still. I watched the last of the daylight fade, the sound of footsteps softening in the hallway. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart rattled. A phone rang, life continued. I thought about the words I hadn't said, the ones about how much it hurt, how much it had always hurt. But maybe they didn't need to be spoken. Some truths didn't need an audience, they just needed air. That night, as I closed my eyes, I knew this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring the fallout, the messages, the accusations, the noise. But tonight, for the first time, I could rest knowing the line had finally been drawn. The next morning, sunlight cut through the blinds in narrow golden lines, but it didn't warm the room. The silence that followed my father and sister's visit felt heavy, almost unreal. For years I had imagined what it might feel like to finally speak the truth out loud, not with anger, but with certainty. I thought I'd feel free. Instead, all I felt was the quiet ache that comes after a wound has been cleaned but not yet closed. I stayed in the hospital for 2 more nights. Megan stopped by briefly before court, checking on me like it was the most natural thing in the world. "They'll reach out," she said, setting a folder on my bedside table. "Don't answer. Everything goes through me now." She handed me a card with her assistant's direct number and a copy of the documents I'd signed. It was strange to hold those papers, the proof that I had drawn a boundary that could not be undone. When I was discharged, the nurse helped me into a wheelchair, and for the first time I realized how unfamiliar it felt to need help. Danielle gave me a soft smile as she adjusted the strap on my brace. "You take care of yourself, okay?" she said. I thanked her quietly. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a wake-up call. Megan had arranged a car to take me home, and during the ride I stared out the window at the city, the same streets I'd driven 100 times before, but they looked different now. The apartment was silent when I walked in. My crutches clicked softly against the hardwood floor. On the counter sat my phone, blinking with unread messages. I didn't need to look to know who they were from. Still, curiosity won for a moment. The first few were from Lauren's short, sharp bursts of anger. "I can't believe you blindsided us. You always want attention." Then came my father's, "This is betrayal, Rachel. Family doesn't do this." Another said, "After all I've done for you." I set the phone face down and let it buzz itself quiet. Megan had been right. Their words weren't about guilt. They were about control. For once, I didn't respond. The silence that followed felt heavier at first, but then something in me began to settle. 2 days later, I opened Facebook and saw the post. It was from my father. "Sometimes the people you love the most hurt you the deepest," it read, especially when they forget where they came from. The comments came fast: sympathy, pity, thinly veiled judgment. Aunt Lorraine wrote, "We raised our kids better than that." Others chimed in about loyalty, about how children today don't value family. I scrolled past them all until one message caught my eye. It was from my cousin Julia, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "I just want you to know I believe you. I saw how they treated you. Lauren was always the storm, and you were expected to hold the umbrella." The words blurred for a moment before I realized I was crying. Quiet tears, the kind that came from being seen rather than from pain. Later that evening, my coworker Nora dropped off groceries. She didn't ask questions. She just set the bags on the counter and said, "You need real food and rest." When she left, she squeezed my shoulder and added, "Don't worry about work. Everyone's got you covered." It was simple, kind, and exactly what I needed. The next few weeks passed slowly. My leg healed bit by bit, but the harder recovery was inside. I spent mornings in physical therapy and afternoons in the quiet of my apartment, learning how to move through the world without apologizing for needing space. Therapy sessions filled the gaps between conversations that forced me to look at years I had tried to forget. My therapist, Dr. Ames, listened as I spoke about the night of the accident, about the phone call, about the long history of being the one who didn't need anything. At the end of one session, she said something that stayed with me. "You weren't loved for who you were, Rachel. You were valued for what you gave. That's not love, that's a transaction." The words landed like truth, sharp but freeing. It wasn't said with pity, just understanding. After that, I began to change small things. I opened a new savings account in only my name. I updated my emergency contacts, removing my father's number. Each action was quiet, but each one felt like reclaiming a small piece of myself. I even started walking outside again, first with the cane, then without it. The air felt different, lighter, honest. One afternoon, Nora stopped by with takeout and asked if I'd seen the newest round of comments online. I hadn't, and she hesitated before showing me. Another post from my father, this one longer, filled with half-truths. "Some people forget who paid for their education. Some forget who sacrificed for them." Dozens of replies followed, each one trying to paint a story I no longer recognized. I didn't reply, and I didn't ask Megan to take it down. Instead, I blocked both him and Lauren on every platform. I didn't do it out of anger. I did it to breathe. The next morning I woke up to silence, no calls, no notifications. The kind of quiet that felt like peace rather than punishment. Over time, that peace began to take shape in new ways. Julia started checking in weekly, a simple text, a small hello. Nora introduced me to her book club, and soon my evenings were filled with gentle laughter and stories that had nothing to do with survival. Even my neighbor, Mrs. Lively, began stopping by with flowers from her garden. None of it was loud or grand. It was soft, ordinary, real. One night as I folded the last of my laundry, I realized how different the apartment sounded. The hum of the dryer, the faint music from a radio down the hall, all simple things, but they carried no tension. For the first time in years, I didn't have to brace myself for a message or a demand. A week later, Megan called to tell me the final round of legal notices had been served and confirmed. They've been officially removed from every document, she said. They can't access anything tied to you. I thanked her quietly. What happens now? I asked. Now, she said, you live your life. That night, I sat by the window, the lights of the city stretching out below. My reflection in the glass looked different, not unscarred, but steadier. The woman staring back at me had stopped waiting for permission to rest. As the days turned into weeks, the ache in my leg faded, replaced by a slower ache that belonged more to memory than to pain. I knew there would still be moments when I'd think of them, birthdays, holidays, the quiet hours between work and sleep. But those thoughts no longer carried the same weight. They were just echoes, now reminders of what had been and what I'd survived. By spring, I could walk without hesitation. I returned to work part-time, easing into a rhythm that felt new and grounded. My boss welcomed me back with a smile, no questions asked, and Nora left a coffee on my desk that simply said, "You did it." And in a way I had. Not in the way people usually meant, not with revenge or applause, but by building something gentler in the space they left behind. I had learned that peace doesn't always come from forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from distance. That evening I opened my window and let the cool air drift in. Somewhere down the street someone was playing a guitar. The sound floated up soft and unsteady, but honest. I sat there until the music faded, the night turning quiet again. Tomorrow I knew there would be more steps to take. Practical ones, emotional ones, but for now I was exactly where I needed to be. The next chapter hadn't begun yet, but for the first time I was no longer afraid of what it might hold. By the time spring turned the edges of the city green again, my leg had healed enough to let me walk without a cane. The doctor said I was lucky. I didn't feel lucky, not exactly, but I did feel lighter, like the constant weight I'd carried for years had shifted somewhere I couldn't reach anymore. The bruises had faded, though some aches still returned with the rain. What lingered most wasn't physical. It was the silence that followed. For weeks, I hadn't heard a word from my father or Lauren. No calls, no texts, no new posts online. Megan had handled every notice, every document, every stray attempt they made to contact me through family. I didn't ask for details. The distance felt strange at first, like a space I didn't quite know how to fill. But that quiet, the one that used to mean abandonment, had started to feel like something closer to peace. One evening after work, Nora stopped by with 2 takeout boxes and that soft concern in her eyes she never said out loud. "You look better," she said, sitting at the counter. "You're actually eating again." I laughed, but she wasn't wrong. For months I'd been living on coffee and adrenaline, surviving each day by force of habit. Now my appetite and sleep were both coming back, one slow inch at a time. After dinner we sat on the balcony with the city below us, talking about everything except what had happened. She mentioned a new project at work, her niece's dance recital, how her mother was learning to paint. Then she looked at me. "You ever think you might move?" she asked. I hadn't, not seriously. But that night after she left, the idea lingered, a quiet whisper that maybe it was time to start over somewhere else, somewhere that didn't hold the echo of old phone calls or unanswered questions. The next morning I opened my laptop and stared at a blank screen. There was nothing to fix, no crisis to handle, no one to check in on but myself. It felt unfamiliar, but freeing. So I did something simple. I wrote down everything I'd survived the accident, the silence, the confrontation, and next to it I listed what had grown in their place. A steady job, a small but reliable circle of people who showed up, the ability to breathe without bracing. That weekend Julia called. We hadn't spoken since her message after my father's post, but hearing her voice was unexpectedly comforting. "I didn't want to bother you," she said. "I just wanted to see how you were doing. We talked for almost an hour." She told me she'd stopped visiting family gatherings too, that she was tired of pretending everything was fine. "It's like everyone's been walking on glass for years," she said. "You finally said what the rest of us were too afraid to." I didn't know how to respond. I wasn't trying to set an example, but hearing that made something inside me unclench. For once, someone in the family had seen the same cracks I had, and they didn't look away. A few days later, I had a follow-up appointment with Dr. Ames. The office smelled faintly of cedar and paper, a quiet space that never judged. She asked if I'd had any contact with my family. I told her no. She nodded slowly. "That's good," she said. "Distance isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's the only way to heal." I hesitated before asking, "Is it wrong that I don't miss them?" She gave a small, knowing smile. "It's not wrong," she said. "It's honest." After that session, I started rebuilding my routine morning walks, work deadlines, dinner with Nora, the occasional call from Julia. Little by little, my world stopped revolving around what my father or sister thought of me. It became my own orbit, smaller maybe, but steadier. Then one afternoon, Megan called. Her tone was even, but there was something in the pause before she spoke. "Rachel, I wanted to let you know your father's made one last attempt to challenge the revocations." I felt my chest tighten. "Can he?" I asked. "Legally, no," she said. "But emotionally, that's another story. He filed an inquiry through his attorney, likely hoping to get your attention. I'll handle it." I thanked her, then sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. It wasn't surprise I felt exactly. It was a dull ache, the kind that comes from recognizing a pattern that refuses to die. My father had built his world around control. Letting go of it wasn't in his nature. But what struck me most was that I didn't feel afraid this time. His anger no longer had the same power. That night, I went for a walk through the park near my apartment. The air was cool and the trees had just started to bloom. Kids played near the fountain, their laughter carrying through the fading light. I sat on a bench, closed my eyes, and let the sound of it wash over me. For the first time in years, I realized I didn't need closure to move forward. I already had it. 2 weeks later, I got a small envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a short note handwritten in careful script. I didn't know how bad it had gotten. "I hope someday you can forgive us." It wasn't signed, but I knew the handwriting my sister's. I turned the paper over in my hands, reading it twice. There were no excuses, no defense, just that one line. I didn't know if it was guilt or growth, maybe both. I folded it once and put it away in a drawer, not out of anger, but because I wasn't ready to decide what it meant. By the end of that month, the last of the paperwork from Megan arrived, confirmation that every account authorization and connection had been sealed. She included a short note on her letterhead. "It's over. Congratulations on reclaiming your freedom." Those words stayed on my fridge, tucked beneath a magnet, a quiet reminder that freedom doesn't always look like celebration. Sometimes it looks like a blank slate. One night, as I was preparing for bed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Julia. "Family dinner next Sunday. Don't worry, it's just me, Aunt Helen, and Nora. Thought you might want to come." I almost said no, old habits die hard, but something in her tone felt different. Safe. So I agreed. The dinner was small, easy, nothing like the gatherings I grew up with. Aunt Helen made roast chicken and mashed potatoes. Nora brought wine, and Julia set the table with mismatched plates that somehow fit perfectly together. There were no sharp comments, no quiet comparisons, just laughter that filled the room. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that sound until I heard it again. When I got home that night, I sat in the quiet and thought about how far things had come since that hospital room. Back then, I'd been lying on a gurney waiting for someone to show up. Now I had people who didn't need an invitation to care. As I turned off the lights, my phone buzzed again, another message from Julia, "Proud of you, Rachel. You're not invisible anymore." I smiled in the dark, the glow of the screen fading slowly. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of rain. I knew storms would still come, as they always do, but this time I wasn't afraid of them. Somewhere along the way, the strong one had finally learned that strength didn't mean standing alone. And as I fell asleep, I understood that what came next wasn't about survival anymore. It was about beginning again. Spring faded into early summer, the kind that fills the air with honeysuckle and thunderclouds that never quite burst. I had fallen into a quiet rhythm again, work therapy, the occasional dinner with Nora or Julia. Life had a steadiness that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. It wasn't loud or exciting, but it was mine. Then one Friday morning, I opened my email to find a message from Megan. The subject line read, "Notice received." My heart sank before I even clicked. Inside her message was brief and to the point. Thomas Monroe has requested mediation to review prior financial transfers. Don't panic. It's a formality, and I've already filed a dismissal. Just a heads up in case you hear from anyone. I stared at the words for a long time. It shouldn't have surprised me, but somehow it did. Even now, months later, my father couldn't let go of control. He wanted a response, a reaction, any sign that I could still be pulled back into the old pattern. Instead, I took a slow breath and forwarded the email to a folder labeled Closed. When I saw Dr. Ames that week, I mentioned it almost casually. She listened quietly, then said, "Sometimes people can't stand the idea that the story moved on without them, but that's not your problem to fix anymore." Her words sat with me the rest of the evening. The following Sunday, Mrs. Lively knocked on my door, holding a vase of lilacs from her garden. "You should have some color in here," she said with a grin. She placed them on my kitchen table, the scent filling the air. "You've been looking more alive these days, Rachel." I thanked her and poured her some tea. We talked about the weather, about her late husband, about how peace doesn't always mean quiet. She said sometimes peace is just knowing you've done all you could. I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until she left. That same night, a new message appeared on my phone, a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated before opening it. "Hi, Rachel. It's Lauren." The words froze me for a second. She hadn't contacted me since the letter. "I'm not asking for anything," she wrote, "but I wanted you to know Dad isn't doing well. He's been drinking more, lost some clients, and keeps saying he wishes things hadn't gone this way." I read it twice before setting the phone down. There was no anger in her message, just something tired. For the first time, her tone didn't sound like manipulation. It sounded like regret. I didn't answer that night or the next. It wasn't out of bitterness, I simply didn't know what to say. A few days later, while walking home from work, I passed a cafe window and caught my reflection in the glass. I barely recognized the woman looking back, her shoulders straight, her eyes clearer than they'd been in years. For a moment, I thought about what my father might see if he looked at me now. Then I let the thought drift away. The next weekend, Julia invited me to a small community event downtown, a fundraiser for a local shelter. "Come with me," she said. "It'll be good to get out." I agreed, not realizing how much I'd missed being part of something that wasn't tied to family tension. The room was filled with laughter, people sharing stories over coffee and music. At one point, a speaker thanked the volunteers, saying, "Healing starts when someone believes you deserve better." I felt those words settle deep in my chest. Later that night, Julia and I walked along the riverfront, the air warm and humming with crickets. She nudged me gently. "You're different now," she said. "Not smaller, not harder, just steady." I smiled. I think I finally stopped waiting for them to change. A few days after that, I received another message from Lauren. I got a new job. "It's not much, but I'm trying. I'm in therapy too. I know that doesn't make up for everything, but I wanted you to know." This time I did reply. "I'm glad you're getting help. I hope it brings you peace." It was short, but it felt right. Weeks went by without another word. The weather turned hot, the kind that makes the air shimmer. My leg only ached when storms rolled through, a dull reminder of where I'd been. One evening, Nora stopped by with iced tea and her usual easy laughter. "You're glowing," she teased. "What's the secret?" I shrugged. "Boundaries," I said, and she laughed. "You make it sound like skincare." But the truth was simpler than that. I'd stopped letting guilt shape my choices. I'd stopped equating forgiveness with surrender. And maybe that was what freedom really was, the quiet space between who you used to be and who you're becoming. In late August, Megan called one last time about the mediation. "It's officially closed," she said. "No further action. You're completely free of their claims." I thanked her, and before she hung up, she added, "You should be proud." Most people never reach this point without looking back. I told her I wasn't planning to. The following weekend, I went back to the park where I'd walked after the mediation notice. The trees were fuller now, the air heavy with late summer warmth. A family was having a picnic nearby, parents laughing, children chasing bubbles across the grass. It should have hurt to watch, but it didn't. It just made me grateful that love could look like something simple, not the constant struggle I grew up with. When I returned home, I found another envelope in my mailbox. This one had my father's handwriting on it, uneven, almost shaky. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper. "I know I failed you. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want you to know I see it now." I sat at the table for a long time staring at the letter. It wasn't the apology I'd once imagined, but it was the truth I never thought he'd admit. I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt still. After all the noise, stillness was enough. That night, I placed both letters, his and Lauren's, in a small box and put it on a shelf in my closet. Not hidden, just set aside. Some memories don't need to be erased. They just need to stop taking up space on the table. The next morning, I woke to sunlight spilling through the blinds. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up with dread or duty. I brewed coffee, opened the window, and let the air in. Somewhere down the hall, Mrs. Lively's radio played a soft tune, and I caught myself humming along. I didn't know what the future held, whether my family would ever truly change, or if we'd stay strangers bound by history. But I knew I was ready for whatever came next. For the first time, my story wasn't about what they took. It was about what I finally kept. Outside, a storm was building on the horizon, but the air felt calm where I stood. I poured another cup of coffee and watched the light shift across the kitchen floor, steady and warm. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it, not as the daughter waiting to be chosen, but as the woman who had already chosen herself. By the time fall arrived, the air had shifted. Mornings carried that crisp edge that hinted at the cold waiting ahead. My days had settled into something steady: work in the morning, walks through the park, after evenings spent cooking simple meals in the quiet. The kind of peace that used to feel like a dream had become something ordinary, almost natural. Then, one Thursday afternoon, I received a call from Megan. "Rachel," she said, her voice calm but deliberate, "your father's attorney reached out again. This time not about finances." I waited, heart steady but expectant. "He's had a health scare, mild heart attack. He's recovering, but Lauren's reached out asking if you'd consider visiting." I leaned against my desk, the sound of traffic below fading to nothing. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I said, "Thank you for telling me." She hesitated before replying, "You don't owe them anything, but if you decide to go, I'll support you either way." That evening, I sat by the window watching rain blur the city lights. The letter from my father still sat in the small box on the shelf, folded neatly untouched since the day I'd read it. I thought about the years between us all, the missed birthdays, the silence after my mother's death, the way love had always come with conditions. And yet the idea of him alone in a hospital bed stirred something softer than anger. Maybe not forgiveness, but understanding. 2 days later, I found myself standing outside the same hospital where my own healing had begun months earlier. The halls looked the same, that familiar blend of antiseptic and coffee, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Lauren was waiting near the elevator, thinner than I remembered her expression, unsure. When she saw me, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. "You came," she said quietly. I nodded. "How is he?" "Better," she said. "Tired. He keeps asking about you." We walked down the corridor together, neither of us speaking. When we reached his room, the door was open just enough for me to see him asleep, older, somehow smaller. His face, once stern and certain, looked softer in rest. Machines beeped steadily beside him, each sound marking time we could never get back. When he opened his eyes, it took him a moment to recognize me. Then his mouth trembled into something like a smile. "Rachel," he said, his voice rough. "You didn't have to come." I took a seat by the bed. "I know." He looked at me for a long time as if trying to decide whether I was real. "You look good," he said finally. "Healthy." It was such a simple sentence, but it carried the weight of years of things never said. Lauren sat in the corner quiet, watching us. The air between us held something fragile, not reconciliation, but acknowledgement. "I read your letter," I said after a moment. "Thank you." He nodded slowly. "I meant every word. I was wrong, Rachel. I thought strength meant not needing anyone. I didn't see what that did to you." The words landed like a slow exhale. I didn't know what to say, so I just let them sit there. For once, silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. The nurse entered to check his monitors, and for a moment the rhythm of beeps and conversation filled the room. When she left, my father looked at me again. "You remind me of your mother," he said. "She carried too much, too. I think that's why I leaned on you the way I did. It wasn't fair." His voice cracked on the last word. And for the first time in my life, I saw him look small, not in stature, but in the quiet realization of his own failures. We spoke for a while longer, small things like how my job was going, how Lauren was settling into her new one. When it was time to go, he reached for my hand. "I don't expect anything," he said. "Just thank you for coming." I squeezed his hand once before standing. "Take care of yourself," I said, and he nodded. Outside the hospital, the air felt sharp, the kind that makes you pull your coat tighter around you. Lauren followed me out, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "He's really trying, Rachel. I think he's scared." I looked at her, at the familiar mix of hope and weariness in her face. "I hope he finds peace," I said. She nodded, eyes glistening. "I hope we all do." We walked to the parking lot together. Before getting into her car, she turned back. "I'm sorry for everything," she said quietly. "For all of it." Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. I took a slow breath. "You don't have to keep saying sorry, Lauren. Just keep doing better." She gave a small nod, tears falling now. "I will," she said. "I promise." When I drove home that night, the city lights blurred through the rain. The air smelled like wet pavement and leaves that faint scent of something ending and beginning all at once. I didn't feel triumphant or broken, just balanced, like something long out of place had finally settled. The next morning I called Dr. Ames and told her what had happened. She listened quietly, then said, "Sometimes closure isn't about forgiveness or apologies. Sometimes it's just seeing someone clearly for the first time." That afternoon, I stopped by Mrs. Lively's apartment with a bouquet of fresh flowers. "You were right," I told her. "Peace isn't quiet. It's knowing you've done what you could." She smiled and patted my hand. "Then I'd say you've earned it." Weeks passed and life resumed its gentle rhythm. My father's health improved, though he retired soon after. Lauren sent occasional updates, brief, respectful, without expectation. Each message was a small reminder that change doesn't always come all at once. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like sunlight through the blinds after a long night. As winter approached, I found myself looking forward to the first snow. I'd always hated it before, the cold, the delays, the heaviness, but now I saw it differently. It was a clean start, a pause before everything began again. On the last evening of November, I sat by the window with a mug of tea watching flakes fall against the city lights. The box on my shelf remained where it had always been, the letters inside untouched. But now it didn't feel like a wound tucked away. It felt like history, something finished, something understood. Somewhere down the hall, Mrs. Lively hummed along with her radio. I smiled, letting the sound fill the room. There was no longer anger in my chest, no guilt pulling at the edges of my heart. Only a quiet kind of strength, the kind that comes after the storm has passed. Outside, the snow kept falling, soft, steady, unhurried, as if reminding me that healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments, in visits, in conversations that rewrite old endings. And though I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, I knew I would meet it with an open heart. I turned off the light, the city glowing beyond the window, and whispered a small goodbye, not to them, but to the version of myself who had once believed love had to be earned. Then, for the first time in years, I slept through the night without dreams. Winter settled in fully that year, covering the city in a soft quiet that felt almost protective. I'd always thought of winter as something harsh, but that season it felt different, less about what was ending and more about what was beginning. Each morning, I woke to pale sunlight spilling through the blinds, the kind that makes everything look washed clean. My days had become simple coffee in the kitchen, walks through the park, dinners with people who stayed because they wanted to, not because they had to. The first snow that stuck came on a Sunday. I met Nora and Julia at a small cafe near the river, the kind with fogged windows and old holiday songs playing low in the background. We sat for hours talking about ordinary things, work recipes, weekend plans. Somewhere in the conversation, Julia said, "You know, I think peace looks good on you." I smiled because she was right. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying someone else's weight. That night when I came home, I took the small wooden box down from the shelf. Inside were the 2 letters, one from my father, one from Lauren. I read them again under the soft glow of the lamp. The words didn't sting anymore. They felt like the last chapter of a book I'd already finished. I folded them carefully, tied a small ribbon around them, and tucked them back inside. I wasn't erasing the past. I was setting it down where it belonged. A few weeks later, I received a short call from Lauren. Her voice sounded steady, stronger somehow. She told me she was keeping up with therapy, that our father was focusing on his health, and that they'd both been reading a lot lately. "He misses you," she said, her tone quiet but sincere. I told her I was glad they were both doing better. There was no awkward silence, no blame hanging in the air, just 2 sisters learning how to speak without the ghosts between them. In February, Mrs. Lively moved to a retirement community near her niece. Before she left, she handed me a potted plant, its green leaves reaching for the light. "Keep this one alive," she said with a wink. "It likes attention. I promised I would." Her absence left the hallway quieter, but her kindness stayed. Some people leave gifts you can't measure, just traces of warmth that linger long after they've gone. Work grew busier in the months that followed, but it felt different now. I wasn't burying myself in it to escape anymore. I was finally building something for myself. Nora and I started meeting every Thursday for dinner, no matter how long the week had been. Sometimes we laughed until closing time, sometimes we sat in comfortable silence. It didn't matter. What mattered was the ease, the steady rhythm of being surrounded by people who didn't make me prove my worth. By early spring, I'd moved into a new apartment, smaller, brighter, with a view that overlooked the park. One afternoon while unpacking, I found an old photo tucked in the pages of a book. It was from years ago, my father, my sister, and me in front of the house we grew up in. I looked younger, hopeful, caught mid-laugh. I placed it on the counter for a while before slipping it into a drawer. Not out of resentment, just acceptance. Some memories are best kept in quiet places, not forgotten, but no longer defining you. As the months passed, the ache that once sat in my chest began to fade. What replaced it wasn't happiness exactly, but balance, a calm understanding that love doesn't have to come with conditions, and family doesn't have to mean pain. I learned that forgiveness isn't about reopening doors. Sometimes it's just deciding not to stand guard at them anymore. On the first warm evening of May, I sat by the window with the plant Mrs. Lively had given me. Its leaves had grown taller, stretching toward the sunset. I thought about everything that had happened, the crash, the hospital, the confrontation, the silence that followed, and realized that what began as a breaking point had become the beginning of a life I chose for myself. When I closed my eyes, I could still hear my father's voice, softer this time, telling me he was proud. Maybe it was memory. Maybe imagination. It didn't matter. I'd spent years trying to earn words like that. Now I didn't need them to believe they were true. If you've ever been where I was trying to hold a family together while losing yourself in the process, I hope you know this. You don't have to keep proving you're worth love. The right people won't need you to. Healing isn't a single moment. It's a series of small choices made quietly, one honest breath at a time. The night breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of lilacs from somewhere down the street. I let it fill the room, soft and sweet, and for the first time it didn't smell like change, it smelled like home. If my story resonated with you, take a moment to breathe, to remember your own strength, and to share this with someone who might need a reminder too. Sometimes that's how healing begins, with one story passed gently from one heart to another.